How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew, this is Lemora's Cards, and today we're doing a breakdown of the Mox Masters Invitational. If you didn't know about this event, this was the culmination of a lot of online events ran by Playing with Power called Mox Masters. They would be these open online events once a month, and we had some of the best cEDH players in the world competing in them. And you earned points for an invitational, kind of like the Top Deck series, and the top performing players got invited for this event that was held in person. So today we're going to be going over a bit about the event, how it was ran, some specific rule stuff, and an overview of it from a spectator's perspective. And then we're going to just hop into the decks that made it to the top 16. So this was a smaller event, around 64 people. But again, this was an exclusive event to only some of the top performers of this big year of cEDH competition. One thing I want to point out is that this event, in a lot of ways, set a new standard, I feel like, for cEDH tournaments for viewership. The commentating was excellent. The quality of the streams were great. It was really easy to see what was happening on the board state. It all looked very nice. And there were these nice player cams that would let you actually see. Sometimes when players were talking, actually get like a look at who's there. This is something Eric and I talked about in our video where we sort of critiqued some current cEDH tournaments and their coverage. And I think this was like a slam dunk home run in that regard. One other thing about the tournament I really liked was that the finals were the first person to win 2 games. So the day 2 was really short because you just had semifinals and then finals. And so the 4 players in finals weren't just competing to see who would win the 1 game. They were competing to win 2 games. So potentially a maximum of 5 games could have happened. It only ended up being 3 games, and we'll get to the deck that won the event. I thought this was really cool, and it really was like this build up. And it was really interesting to see because a lot of other Magic, it's a little bit more typical to play best of 3 or best of 5, etc. And it was cool to implement something sort of similar to that in a cEDH event. The one negative thing I had to say about this event was viewing it visually and all of that, like I said, was really great, but the structure of the event, I guess, led to some really ridiculously long intermissions where you're just sitting there watching episodes of Playing with Power for 10, 20, 30, maybe as much as 40. I don't know. It was easy to just kind of forget what I was doing minutes at a time. That was pretty rough. They did their best to sort of move players over or move the camera setup over. They tried their best to sort of scramble and when a game went sort of short and get to the next thing and get it on screen, but it was clear that there wasn't really a setup that made this easy to do. So I think some planning for that in the future, for the future events. I think it would have been fine to me to just put the camera on somebody and let them talk, maybe do a player interview if anyone was interested. Something other than that long of a just here's some YouTube videos to watch kind of intermission. That was pretty rough. It made it, even though I was really invested in the event, it made it really easy to just tune out because there's nothing going on. That is part of the tough logistics of running an event, so that kind of stuff's gonna happen, but that's about the only negative that I have for watching the event. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go. I don't really compete too much in online events, and that event was nowhere near me, but it looks like it was cool, and there was an open and last chance qualifier for you to compete in as well. We're not gonna go over that today, but super cool. Really love that part of the event. Now let's hop into the top 16. The Command Tower software by Eminence Gaming is perfect for hosting your own TCG events with features such as easy to create event registration for 4-player and 1v1 Swiss-based games. Event management has never been so simple, and it's web-based, so no downloads required. Sign up for just $5 at eminence.events/subscribe. First up, you know it, you love it. We have Hallenium's TNK Breach, otherwise known as Blue Farm, Tymna, Kraum, whatever you call this deck. This is kind of the standard of cEDH at the moment. I mean, this is, as we talked about in our last quarterly update, this is kind of the deck for cEDH right now. Not a lot of stuff to talk about for this version of the list. So a few notable cards. The One Ring has been somewhat contentious. Some people aren't really sure if they want it. This list did opt to run the One Ring. We also saw Touch the Spirit Realm chose to be ran here. A lot of players have really liked the flexibility that this card's off. A lot of players have really liked the flexibility that this card offers to be able to interact at instant speed, potentially getting rid of something like a Grand Abolisher, protecting your own combo piece or value engine. Just a really flexible way to interact in a game that lines up well with cards like Vamp Tutor and Lighten Tutor to be able to like Kraum trigger in response, tutor for touch the spirit realm, draw it, flicker out your whatever it is. This list did choose to run Fire Covenant and Toxic Deluge, so choosing to go a little heavy on the board wipes, no damn, but these are cards that, again, use your life total as a resource to be able to clear the board. Super flexible, really good if you're expecting very grindy, very creature-heavy matchups. I know a lot of people this weekend were expecting a ton of Kinnan. We actually didn't end up seeing a lot of it make it to the top 16, because I think people were really on top of knowing that that deck was going to be a problem. Phantasmal Image, not a card that has been 100% in every single blue farm list, but the clone effects in general, I think, are just seeing a huge resurgence because of how many ridiculous creatures. And this was just the weekend of Dockside. If you watched the top 16, Dockside was just warping the entire game around it, as it tends to do, really showing itself to be clearly like the most broken card in the format right now. Yeah, for the most part, this is a pretty typical blue farm list. Also is choosing to run Born Upon a Wind. We have seen lists that aren't on Necropotence. They don't really necessarily have a go-to plan for this card. Just run it anyways because it's just really, really strong. It turns out 2 mana flash cantrip is really great. We saw some crazy plays happen with this, and I think we're going to see more of it. A lot of people doing things like winning on their upkeep with Pact of Negation or winning on the instep after necroing, which again, this deck isn't on necro. It allows the sort of draw go nature, especially these super competitive like top 16 tournaments, to just really be played into. Just like, you know, I want to hold up mana for interaction. I also get to do this. I also get to just flat play this if there's a wheel and then maybe get to dump my hand early. Like there's just a lot that it offers, but for the most part, this is a pretty typical blue farm deck list. Up next, we have 2 decks that are kind of similar. Yidris Maelstrom Wielder. This is a deck that hasn't been super popular lately, and this is basically like 4-color Storm. This is, instead of adding whites and getting your silence effects, you know, like people talk about the cEDH as in relation to like a Grixis deck. And this is adding cards like Tinderwall, adding cards like Birds of Paradise, Elvish Spirit Guide, Veil of Summer, Worldly Tutor, be able to get things like your Dockside, Noxious Revival, to have this really strong Storm engine. There's a ton of cheap and free interaction. This looks like a deck that can just super push for wins. This is basically cEDH, the Epic Storm. If you're not familiar with that deck, that's a 4-color Storm deck right now in Legacy that's running around. Running Song of Creation. This is something that Eric and I actually talked about wanting to do. It's really cool to see this in the top 16 already. It's another thing that green adds. It's just this super Storm engine. A really cool sort of synergy that this deck has with this card is the ability to go get it with Beseech the Mirror, which allows you to go get a 4-drop like this. So this has just seen a ton of play and is this huge player in the format right now, giving you this tutor that can be your extra copy of Culling Ritual. It can be your extra copy of Mnemonic Betrayal, a wheel. It can be your extra copy of the One Ring, or in this case, an extra copy of Song of Creation, which is, again, this like massive Storm engine that's really hard to stop if they get going. If you have a couple cards in your hand, especially a couple free ones, and you get the Song Creation down, you get to go super crazy. This is a really cool deck list that is really all in, but of course gets to run a ton of cheap interaction. You've got your Thoracle, Consult combos, you've got Breach, and you have a couple cards that benefit off of your commander. So if you're not familiar with Yidris, when it deals combat damage to a player, spells cast from your hand gain Cascade. So when you cast something like a Tinderwall, for example, you cascade until you find a 0-drop, which could be something like Inevitable Betrayal, Profane Tutor, Wheel of Fate that these decks run. And then also it can just go get your Chrome Mox, Mana Crypt, etc. These are just strong cards. Again, they work really well with the top deck tutors, but that can just be like really this huge mana cheat offered by this commander, which is kind of the main reason to run it, other than just wanting these colors. And speaking of these colors, we have Thrasios Vial Smasher, but this is a lot more like the last deck than it is something resembling Curious Control. This is not a Seedborn Muse really grinding them out with Thrasios kind of deck. This is another Storm deck. I mean, it's using Thrasios to win with things like Temur Sabertooth Dockside, but other than that, it's just wanting these colors to play a 4-color Storm plan. You have a lot of ability to get your Dockside with the green tutors. Again, the black tutors kind of let you do whatever you want. You get broken cards again, like Culling Ritual, Beseech the Mirror. This deck not opting to run Song of Creation. It is a bold choice to begin with, but one I would have liked to see. But this is choosing to run things like Basalt Kinnan because, again, what you lack in the sort of explosive potential that Yidris can have, you get a lot of combo potential with Thrasios. Again, kind of a similar Storm engine. We're seeing cards like Fire Covenant again. The One Ring, again, being chose to run in this ad nauseum deck. Eric and I sort of talked about this a little bit in one of the last podcast episodes, that we're seeing a lot of this sort of chunky Nas with 4 and 5 drops, you know, with Beseech specifically kind of pushing you towards running like good 4-mana spells. We're seeing a lot of ad nauseum decks that are a little bit higher up on the curve, so maybe their ability to main phase Nas is a little bit worse if they don't hit something hot or if they don't have a lot of ritual effects. But this deck, of course, does, being a really heavy dockside kind of focused deck. Another super cool list. Really happy to see these sort of 4-color storm decks kind of take off using green and showing that green has some strengths in the format still. Next up, we have Atraxa Grand Unifier. As we've talked about on the last couple of episodes of the quarterly updates that we've done, this has been a deck to really watch out for. This is the food chain deck list of the format. It has a lot of flexibility in how you build it. As you can see, this list opting to run things like Displacer Kitten with Teferi, running Grand Arbiter Augustin IV, which we've seen in Atraxa and in Tivit. More of your broken 4-color spells like Culling Ritual, the One Ring, of course. A card we saw a decent bit of in those sort of Tivit lists and any of the other sort of decks that are a little bit slower, more on the mid-rangey side, is cards like Blind Obedience and Smothering Tithe. Blind Obedience specifically is really good in a dockside world, especially if you're also a dockside deck, which we'll get to some decks running this that were on that. It makes sure dockside kind of crazy, but just a cheap piece you can get down in the early game that keeps your opponents from having turns that are too explosive, but also it's a card that doesn't affect you at all. This deck opted to run Cavern of Souls, which is pretty interesting. You have sort of the flexibility to do the human tribal thing, I guess, if you want. Really, it's just, we're seeing some decks just choose to run Cavern of Souls as extra insurance. It lets you do things like Castador, Tainted Pact, or Demonic Consultation first, and then before your land drop, and then people let it resolve, hoping to respond to your Thoracle, play Cavern of Souls, naming Wizard or Merfolk, and then you have an uncounterable Thassa's Oracle to probably win the game. Of course, also you can just name Phyrexian or Angel and get an uncounterable Atraxa. Just a card that can really help you make sure you get out your things like Opposition Agent and Ranger Captain in a way that people can't interact with them very easily. One of the few Doctor Who cards that we saw this weekend is Flesh Duplicate. This is a really sick, mostly upgrade for Phantasmal Image that works really well with these sort of like flicker effects. For instance, one thing you couldn't do before is if you had Displacer Kitten and you were on Fimage, you couldn't keep flickering the Fimage because as soon as you target it sacrifices. Flesh Duplicate gets around that. So a lot of the Atraxa decks were opting to run cards like Fimage just as a little bit of value, an ability to, copy a dockside, copy your Atraxa. And this is most of an upgrade. It is slightly harder to cast, which is more of a problem in these 4-color decks than it is in something like Kinnan, which we'll get to. But yeah, this is for the most part a kind of typical Atraxa deck list, looking to go kind of longer, generate a bunch of value, get out the girl, win with food chain, kitten stuff, Thoracle, etc. Next up, we have Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. This is a list that looks really similar to Wounded's Grind Them into Dust, where we see some of those signature cards like Armored Scrap Gorger, Karn the Great Creator, Glen Elendra, which a lot of the Kinnan players I think have moved to, Thorn Mammoth, Nezahal, all the sort of grindier Kinnan options. This deck did not choose to run Flesh Duplicate over Phantasmal Image. I'm curious to know why, as it is mostly an upgrade in this deck list because it lets you do things like Hullbreaker Horror or Tidespell Tyrant loops with copying somebody's dockside or things like that. But we did see a cool little bit of tech in Aboleth Spawn. This is a card people kind of talked about for a little bit, but hasn't ended up seeing a lot of play recently. It's 3-mana flash. When a creature entering the battlefield under an opponent's control causes a triggered ability of that creature to trigger, you may copy that ability, you may choose new targets for the copy. Things like Dockside Extortionist, things like Thassa's Oracle. So this is a card that lets you get a bunch of potential value or even combo potential off of what your opponents are doing. There's a lot of powerful enter the battlefield effects running around right now. Sometimes this card lines up awkwardly against Dockside because your trigger happens first, but being that you're running Kinnan, you can often just crack those treasures and it'll net you another Kinnan activation. But then also just with things like the creature tutors, Imperial Recruiter, Spellseeker, things like that, this can just be 3-mana. I also get to tutor, and it kind of makes people think twice about the next ETB creature that they might want to play. Last March of the Ants is a really spicy inclusion. If you missed this card in Lord of the Rings, it is an uncounterable card that will draw you a bunch of cards, draw cards equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control, then put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. The floor is incredibly low, of course, but the ceiling, especially in a deck like Kinnan that can have massive creatures, draw like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cards and then put any creatures you have into play, can be incredibly powerful. Kinnan can get up to 8 mana pretty easily, but sometimes your main source of like card advantage in certain points of the game is just being able to flip off of Kinnan. So you don't get that high roll with it, but you do get an uncounterable way to reload your hand and dump a whole bunch of dudes into play, and that's pretty sick. Agatha's Soul Cauldron, this card helps you filter your mana from Basalt Monolith with Kinnan, making infinite mana. This lets you spend mana as though it were mana of any color, lets you combo with Kinnan. It also lets you just turn your guys into dorks, turn your guys into ranger captains. This is a card I've been really high on recently, and it's cool to see. I'm looking forward to see if more decks will opt to run this, because I think it's actually more flexible than it may have appeared early on. And for the most part, pretty typical mana base, a little low on the land count, going down to 25, but for the most part, a kind of typical Kinnan list. And here we see another Atraxa, again opting to run cards like Flesh Duplicate, this time swapping Grand Arbiter with Talion, which in my testing has been a pretty absurd card. A value engine that your opponents can't pay for, pretty warping, and that life total dings that it does on you, the 2 damage, it also can really add up. So interested to see more Talion being played as we go further into the post Eldraine meta. Pretty similar to what we saw earlier with Atraxa, just a really powerful deck. Has a lot of good colors, lets you have big payoffs for generating a bunch of mana, run little bitty stacksy stuff, cool cards like Bowmasters, get some mana with Lotho, win with Oracle, Food Chain, all that jazz. Here we have Dargo Thrasios. Typically at this point in the tournament, you'd expect this deck to be piloted by FreedomWaffle, but Freedom chose not to run Dargo Thras. Freedom was on Blue Farm, surprisingly. Notable cards here, we have, of course, Temur Sabertooth for Dockside. This deck did opt to run Dualcaster Mage as a win condition. Not every version of this deck is running it. A card that can just get you some good value. You can just copy somebody else's Demonic Tutor, Vamp Tutor, things like that. But of course, it has the flexibility of being a good target with Twin Flame to win the game. And Twin Flame, a card that is probably underrated in these Temur Simic kind of base shelves, because you have so many creatures that enter the battlefield and do things. You're a dockside focused deck. It can even be pretty decent in a pinch with Imperial Recruiter and Spellseeker, and it can loop if you strive it with Eternal Witness and Dockside. No Dualcaster Mage required. And it probably does some absurd things with Displacer Kitten. We see Final Fortune. We saw this card a lot this weekend. Pretty strong, getting to take an extra turn, take advantage of that. Instant speed, Time Walk. Notable exclusion with this deck was that there is no Seedborn Muse. It is not looking to do the Seedborn Thrasios thing. We do have Training Grounds, which is usually a card that you see more often with that sort of Thrasios focused game plan. But of course, it can also work to help your Temur Sabertooth math get a little bit better. So not necessarily always together, but usually paired together. And then cards like Greater Good Goblin Bombardment, which lets you take advantage of your Dargo in the command zone and combo off. Fairly similar to what we've seen previously. Of course, running cards like Birthing Pod to get to sack Dargo and go get Tidespout Tyrant. Super cool little synergy that you get. Relic of Legends is a card that we keep seeing in decks that sort of just want a rock that can do a little baby dockside impression sometimes. We keep seeing a lot of legends get printed. This deck, of course, having 2 commanders, Ragavan, Kinnan, Bergi, that might be out at any given time. And of course, if you're looping Dargo, that's another way to generate mana. It can kind of be your extra copy of Bergi in that scenario. Now, here's a deck that might be a little bit of a blast from the past, and that is Edric, Spymaster of Trest. This is the deck that has, in a lot of people's minds, gotten a little bit worse as games have gotten creature heavier, have gotten really creature heavy. It can really reward your opponents who are already doing like the Tymna sort of game plan, but also it can just be really hard to get in when there's so many creatures in play at any given time. I can't pretend that I'm super up to date with the current Edric tech, but I can point out some cool cards that you might not be used to seeing in the 99 of some lists. Malcolm making an option here. Of course, there's always a good sort of like Tymna attacker, things like that. Just good. Mercurial Spell Dancer is a card that some people were on earlier and have kind of abandoned. Fairy Mastermind. A lot of these sort of like blue, hey, maybe this is good with Tymna cards making their way into here. Shigeki being a pretty dope channel card that's just like, this is like a card that I think people just tend to sleep on, mainly over in casual where it sees more play, but like just pretty good. Really cool card. Uro Titan of Nature's Wrath, not one you almost ever see in cEDH. Lots of ability in this deck to draw cards incrementally and getting value on attack and damage. Colossal Sky Turtle is a card that we saw mainly be for the Kinnan decks, but really any sort of like non-Nas blue-green deck could run this as just a flexible, uncounterable effect. Deflecting Squad gets you, but again, we've seen the power of Channel, and having 2 really relevant Channel abilities on one card, pretty nice. The thing you might know this deck for is the Time Walk effects. We've got Temporal Manipulation, Capture of Jingzhou, whatever this one is. Notorious Thrung, pretty nice. And then again, cards that let you get cards back from your graveyard, like we said, Colossal Sky Turtle, Regrowth, Noxious Revival. These cards are getting a lot of extra value because this deck really likes being able to just draw a ton of cards, keep those extra combats going until it can find its win. And any of those cards that recur those extra turn things just make your life so much easier. And yeah, really cool to see this deck that hasn't been as popular lately really just make a comeback and do well at one of the most competitive events ever. If you know a bit more about this deck and some cards that maybe are notable that I'm not aware of, please feel free to let me know down in the comments because I don't want to look too dumb. But I really like just seeing stuff like this do well. And I think Simic in general is just pretty strong at the moment. Next up, we have the Dargo trader himself, FreedomWaffle. Super cool dude. Running Blue Farm. This list opting to be a few cards different, of course. We had Boromir, which has been a card that we've seen sort of put in either in place of or alongside with Lavinia, being pretty similar to that card, but also having, you know, extra play against things like Orcish Bowmasters, which might normally make easy work of a lot of the Tymna stuff going on, but having this creature that can sit there and say like, no, you're not going to be able to blow up my stuff. It's not happening. On top of also just really controlling what people are allowed to do, turning off those free mana rocks. Pretty strong effect. And a 3/3 attacker for Tymna. Perfect. Again, though, seeing more clones even in Blue Farm. Phyrexian Metamorph and Phantasmal Image coming in. People love their clones. People love being able to copy things like Dockside Extortionist, sometimes even a Drannith Magistrate, or a Ranger Captain, or a Opposition Agent. Just so many powerful game warping creatures, and people are really taking note of it and opting to run lots of ways to get access to even more of them. Spicier, I guess, addition is Reanimate. Kind of for, I'm guessing, the same reasons that we've seen previously. It's really good to get back some of your creatures or get, again, access to somebody else's. You take out that Kinnan player's Consecrated Sphinx and then you can get your own. Pretty freaking good. Sacking your Ranger Captain, getting your own. We've seen the Mardu decks opt to use their reanimation effects, even on like sort of more incremental things. Again, getting back a Boromir after sacrificing it. Or, of course, getting back your Dockside after you've milled it, getting back the Thoracle, making another win attempt, or just taking somebody else's thing that's already died. It's a super flexible card that honestly, the cheap reanimation effects are probably a lot more splashable than maybe some people have made them out to be. Of course, powerful deck, did really well. Congrats to FreedomWaffle. Wouldn't you know, the best deck in the format is here yet again with another Blue Farm deck, this time piloted by Snake. This being one that chose to run Ceres in it, so a little bit different than the others, but also again choosing to run Boromir. Like I said, this is a good card. People were really high on Lavinia. This one's way easier to cast, and it has some nice flexibility in that it can protect your dudes. And again, we're seeing Reanimate. I think there might have been some collusion here. I think there might have been some building together here in one of these special discords. So yeah, Boromir and Reanimate both shared here. Diabolic Intent, which not every Blue Farm player is on, but for the most part, pretty similar to the previous list. Dress Down again. This is a card that a lot of decks can kind of just go with if they expect some kind of Staxy effect, or maybe even using it in response to a Thoracle or a Dockside. Just a really flexible card, being able to do it on the instep before your turn and then having it throughout your turn to maybe turn off a Collector Roof so you can power out some things, or maybe turn your Breach Loop back online. Very nice. And here we have our first pure Grixis deck, and that is Tevesh Kraum. This is a deck that was doing really well earlier this year and kind of fell off a little bit as we went into the middle of this year, and we are seeing a really dedicated pilot in Sharky bringing it back here. A Nas deck that's on Hullbreaker Horror is a little rough, as we saw in one of the games, and running Notion Thief in a Bowmaster's world is certainly a choice that I don't usually make, but I also didn't top 16 this event, so what do I know? We see another Reanimate, of course, really good when you have cards like Dockside, Displacer Kitten, even Hullbreaker Horror being able to just mill that, bring it back. Another deck choosing to run Beseech, Toxic Deluge, this one being on a lot more wheels. This is a little bit more able to take advantage of those sort of effects because you're just running such a density of gas. We also see Born Upon a Wind in conjunction with Final Fortune, and it's even better here because this is our first Necropotence deck that we're covering. Necro is still a good card, and I think with Born Upon a Wind, it certainly got a lot better having that extra out to be able to just dig deep and win. Maybe not even on like just dumping cards, often just being able to win. It's sort of just like Necro in combination with Born Upon a Wind or Final Fortune as just a build your own ad nauseum. It's pretty dang good. Especially with Born Upon a Wind, you get advantage of all of the cards that the Necro sees. That is so much better and so much more powerful, even than Final Fortune, which again is already a really strong option here. Mystic Reflection, this is something that we've seen a lot in the Tevesh decks because you get to make Thralls and they can become Docksides or whatever you want them to be. Other than that, it is kind of the typical Grixis shell that we see. It's a little bit different again because you're not having something like a Roger in the command zone. You got 2 5-mana commanders, so it makes the cards you want to focus on are a little bit different, and it makes a card like Hullbreaker Horror make any amount of sense, of course. Cool to see this deck spike another really nice finish. And wouldn't you know it, our boy Zain got there with Rockside, one of the coolest decks ever. Grixis Enchantress, just outside of top 4. Managed to get there. This is a go burr deck. You've heard us talk about this on the channel so much. Eric and I love talking about this deck, running all of the Final Fortune effects, running cards like Infernal Plunge, Culling the Weak, Diabolic Intent, so many different ways to take advantage of the very broken fact that you have a 0 mana commander. All of the wheels that can get his hand on, I guess, other than Dark Deal. Beseech the Mirror, again, showing up here. Here, not as a way to find your other 4 mana-ish, you know, powerful things, but again, just a way to get an extra copy of a wheel, a copy of Mnemonic Betrayal, a copy of Praetor's Geist if you need it. Whatever you need it to be. The only thing in this deck it can't be is a Force of Will or an Ad Nauseam. Everything else is fair game. Again, another deck that's running Necropotence, one of the best Underworld Breach decks in the format. Some notable cards that we haven't seen, that you don't really often see in decks other than Roxai, being Conqueror's Flail, which is just a nice way to turn your little guy into a Grand Abolisher. Defense Grid, which other decks have ran, but of course you have access to white. It tends to be a little bit less popular. A lot of the Rockside decks have been on Grinding Station since kind of around after Cookout, where Zain won Surfside with it. Just getting you another way to like sort of instantly win with your Underworld Breach. Very nice. But for the most part, this is pretty much the same sort of list that we've seen for the past couple months, other than, you know, with the addition of Beseech the Mirror. Choosing not to run the One Ring here, it probably is just a little too clunky in a Nas deck that has just this good of an Ad Nauseam. And it might just be a little bit slow when you can do so many other broken things as early as turn 1 when you have Rograkh helping you power it out. All right, going into our top 4. First up, we have Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. This is a deck Eric and I talked about a lot because it's really cool and it's been doing really well all year. You got a nice suite of Planeswalkers that are both going to help you get Sisay pumped up because all of them are multicolored, as well as just being pretty good cards that are easy to tutor and or can help you combo. So Aminatu and Nicole Bolas, mainly there for comboing. Aminatu being able to flicker, you know, things like Dockside, of course, very broken. Ashiok, a really impactful stacks piece. This is a card we saw more of around when it released in like 2020, where decks were just kind of running it as a way to turn off searches and also hate out your opponent's graveyards. Oko just being a broken card that can really warp the game. Just immediately uptick it, make a food, make somebody's thing a 3/3, and then just take their best thing. So one card that, again, this is a deck that's choosing to run Talion. Talion just seems so obvious in this now that I see it here. A legendary, you know, 2-color, really good value engine in the command, that you can tutor for from your command zone with Sisay. Seems perfect. One that's maybe not as typical is Rocco Cabaretti Caterer. So this, much more known for being in the command zone, but is again one of the best creature tutors kind of period. It's one of the most flexible cards really like ever printed, and in a deck that was often described during top 4 as Dockside as your commander, basically Dockside with partner, having another way to get to it. Pretty good. You have a meal here to combo with Dockside. If this deck gets access to a Dockside, it so often ends up just being a win. So powerful with a commander that can just go grab whatever you want. Again, like we expected, Relic of Legends, Agatha's, just slam dunks in this deck. Blind Obedience, again, a really impactful card in a Dockside world. Every single deck in the top 4, Dockside deck. Dockside was massively impactful in how the top 4 shook out. Blind Obedience also was a little bit of a negative we saw in one of the top 4 games, where Blind Obedience caused one player to make a ton of tap treasures with Smothering Tithe, which in the moment was good, but then once when these Blind Obedience was dealt with, another player was able to Dockside and just make a billion treasures off of all the tap treasures that couldn't be thrown away. And that's just a thing that can happen with stacks pieces sometimes, but still pretty powerful, impactful card. Again, we're seeing things like Fire Covenant, slam dunk cards like Eladamri's Call. Only the one sorcery with Demonic Tutor. That's kind of cute to see. Choosing not to run cards like Neoform and Eldritch Evolution. Kind of what we've expected to see with Sisay. You get a lot of flexibility in how you build this deck. A lot of things that you might value. Again, here we saw Rocco being splashed for. A lot of other players might choose to run something a little bit different. Really powerful, really cool card with some of the most unique things in the 99 that you'll see. And it brought it here to a 4th place finish. Then we see the last, so we got Grixis in top 4, and it wasn't Roxai. What was it? It was Krark. Krark Silas takes advantage of Krark's ability to make your best spells twice as good half the time, and taking advantage of Silas giving you 2 of the best colors in cEDH. So this deck instead of going all in on Krark flips to try to break that and run sort of more synergistic cards like we've seen in Krark Sakashima, this deck is way more similar to something like a Rograkh. There's a whole bunch of tutors. There's a whole bunch of ways to make mana. There are some things that are more Krark cards like Overmaster. Of course, this card gets basically an extra ad nauseum in the form of Gitaxian Probe. If you can get enough Krarks, you still do run some cards that help you break parity on your Krark triggers: Harmonic Prodigy, Tavern Scoundrel, and Veyron. All of these helping you get more value out of Krark and just make it more consistent. This is really like a real true Storm deck because you have that sort of A plus B capability of I can just be a Grixis ad nauseum Underworld Breach Thassa's Oracle deck that Grixis Colors offers you. And then again, you also just get all of your free spells are just the best things you can have because Krark always makes sure they resolve and can often even let them resolve and go back to your hand, which is super broken in defending yourself or just making sure that nobody can get through on your spells. So yeah, getting to take advantage of free spells. You don't get quite as good of a mana enabler or a, sack fodder kind of dude being there, but what you make up for that in being able to double up your Deadly Relics, double up your Mox Salvage, your Submerge, and just lead to probably higher highs than Rograkh with maybe actually a much lower floor because sometimes your Demonic Tutor doesn't resolve, but then sometimes you spend 2 mana and you get 2 Demonic Tutors like we saw in Grand Finals and you just go get your whole Breach combo and you're good. So really cool deck list to see do well at an event. I always love seeing turbo decks do well and seeing one top 4 and be one of the decks that actually get a win in the top 4 pod. This deck getting a single win of the 3 wins that we saw in top 4. Super, super cool. I love this deck. It makes me really want to try it, getting to see it there and especially watching it go off. And once the thing works, it just seems amazing and unbeatable. And now we get the spicier list that you might not know about. Maybe you do. That is Narset and Enlightened Exile coming at 2nd place. This is a deck that really takes advantage of the fact that there are lots of broken cards in this format and Narset can get you access to them, being like a little mini mnemonic betrayal every time you attack. Just let me get your thing, play it for free. And, sometimes that can be an ad nauseum. Sometimes that can just be a Demonic Tutor and getting a free, even when you hit a Demonic Tutor off of Ragavan, it feels like winning the lottery. Getting it off of Narset is just you get it for free too, and your creatures all have prowess. You just really get to beat people down. This card just has so much text. It's so good. So this deck is pretty all in on the Breach. It's like your main way to win. Honestly, looking through the deck might be your only way to win other than taking somebody else's win. You run some really interesting synergistic cards that Narset makes really strong. A really cool one is Stubborn Denial, which we usually only see in like Niv decks, but Niv takes forever to get online. And it's cool because Narset having prowess means that if Narset's in play, this is always just 1 mana counter target non-creature spell, which is like a big upgrade on something like an Offer You Can't Refuse, which is still very runnable in cEDH, but has that bit of a downside. Angel's Grace is a really interesting addition here. Sometimes you might see this card and you might cringe because if you don't have anything to do with it, it kind of sucks. But being able to take advantage of your own Final Fortune and being able to cast your own Final Fortune again from the graveyard with Narset and being able to Angel's Grace yourself through like getting an extra turn or 2. Really, really cool option that this deck gets. Really cool synergy. And if you can't, being able to functionally just turn Final Fortune into like a 3 mana, kind of like a 3 mana-ish Time Walk, pretty freaking sick. Running good cards like Teferi's Time Raveler, Jace Wielder of Mysteries is a way to win after you deck yourself. That has like, a bit higher card quality than like Thassa's Oracle itself does. Cool 2-for-1s like Rushing River. Pull from Eternity also being able to let you pull from Eternity, another cool option because this lets you put a card that you've already like exiled with Narset, or maybe even one that you use as the escape cost with Breach, put it back into the graveyard. Especially this being instant speed, being able to like respond to the Narset trigger and like, okay, you've already used the Demonic Tutor, it's exiled, boom, put it back in there, put somebody's Breach in, maybe they lost the Breach, lost part of their combo, whatever. You saw something with a, Desperate Tainted Pact. You can just put it back in the graveyard, edit its speed, boom. Maybe they weren't going to block because there isn't much in the graveyard. Boom, now there is something super broken in the graveyard. Just a really cool option. It's cool to see a deck with this synergistic sort of a build, but it's also very much just a kind of focused Jeskai Breach deck that can, generate a bunch of value, clone some stuff with something like Imposter Mech, grind out with the One Ring, has a commander that is actually good with Lightning Greaves, and can really just take advantage of, hey, all my opponents are playing lots of broken cards. Let's say, get some of those broken cards for me too. And finally, our winner who won 2 of the 3 games played in top 4, that is Samurai Dancer's Malcolm Kediss deck list. Yes, is it? This is very much a deck very focused on doing the Malcolm thing. We have a whole bunch of cards that combo with this that are all here for this. We have, of course, Glenhorn Buccaneer. We've got Reckless Fireweaver that turn into a pirate. Boom. You get to do the thing. And it wins the game. Hedron Detonator, turn into a pirate, wins the thing. You can do Niv-Mizzet Curiosity stuff with Tandem Lookout, Curiosity, and Phidian Eye. There is just a whole bunch of ways to just win the game. And that's kind of what we saw in the top 4, especially was just like, you know, oh, you got rid of my turn 1 Malcolm. Boom. I have mana for turn 2 Malcolm. Boom. I can just do a turn 3 win. Magda, super sick card here as both a payout for your treasures, being able to search for an artifact, Maskwood Nexus, which is again just really good in the deck, being able to turn those things into pirates, and also just makes it even better with Magda. Like there's a lot of layered, really powerful synergy stuff going on here. Also pretty good at just finding you a Niv-Mizzet and putting it into play if you don't have it. We saw Niv-Mizzet really take over one of the finals games and just be almost unbeatable and create a board state that's just almost impossible to win through. Really cool deck running some cards that you don't often, you know, see in cEDH, and just choosing to say, you know what, I'm not that worried about this whole no bad cards thing. Of course, you got broken cards in here like Dockside, Fimage, Phyrexian Metamorph, again, the clone effects, which is massive in this entire event and just right now in general. Goblin Matron to go get your Dockside. 5 mana Dockside's worth it too. Face Breaker, turning your Malcolm into double Malcolm. Running some of the extra turn effects. So here we have Last Chance and Final Fortune. So running 2 of them. Lots of interaction, lots of really cutesy stuff that like turns your creatures into pirates, like Artificial Evolution and Trickery Charm. But if it's winning, it wins a major tournament. It's really easy to write off something like this. It's just like, oh, they just happen to spike a win. But when you have to qualify for the, up to this point, most competitive tournament ever, then you have to compete in the Swiss rounds of the most competitive tournament ever, make it to semis, win that, make it to finals, and then win 2 games in that finals pod, which the first game you could say, sure, you know, winning the first game is whatever. And that, going for that second game, once you have 1 win, you are public enemy number 1. I think it's even harder to get those extra wins, especially it being that early. You know, we only saw 3 games of the potential 5. You know, people really have you on the radar and they know what you're up to and they know your tricks, and they got a little bit more experience in the matchup, and it still just did it. It just kept putting win attempts into play, kept doing the thing, was super meticulously piloted. I mean, we saw crafting a board that was just unbeatable essentially before even choosing to pass the turn, just to just really be able to get in, just make sure it happens. Really cool deck. The top 4 was such a unique top 4 with really cool synergistic sort of builds that also have really high card quality and just were piloted obviously incredibly well. Really cool to see a deck like this take it down. I'm pretty sure you didn't have your money on Malcolm Kediss, but it was here and it competed at the top level and it won. You definitely can't sleep on this deck, cannot write it off. Don't sleep on its pilot either. Congratulations. This is super cool. Very cool event. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below what you liked about it. If you want to see more of this sort of tournament coverage, maybe you want to see me and Eric, you know, talk about it together, let me know. Let me know what you want to hear about. What do you think about what this says about the metagame? I think clone effects are really on the up and up, and it also seems like sort of the synergistic builds that can keep pushing for wins are really good when everyone is really taking it slow and grinding. One thing I didn't mention earlier about this event was that in the Swiss, there were a ton of draws because people were just kind of playing it super safe. I don't think it really had anything to do with the structure of the event. I think it was mainly like, wow, this is a high stakes event. I really want to do well and play it safe. Are lots of people just hiding behind value engines and being able to do that and then just put out win attempts over and over because your commander is just a win con that's really good, or, you know, having that really broken commander that can just crack the game wide open seems really powerful right now. So let me know what you think about this event, what you think about the decks that did well in it, and what you're looking forward to playing and trying out that you saw in this event. I really want to try Krark Silas. Maybe I'll even try Malcolm Kediss. Let me know down below what I should try. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to all my amazing patrons over on Patreon. Support me over there to get access to all kinds of cool stuff. New stuff's going to be coming over there soon, so keep an eye out over there. All that being said, go play cEDH. Have a good one.